Hi, my name is Philip Bither. I'm the curator for performing arts here at the Walker Arts Center, and this morning we're really thrilled to have Mitch Epstein, photographer, artist, and Erik Friedlander, cellist, composer, with us around the premiere of American Power. We've made it through a couple of very successful run-throughs, and we have the premiere tonight.
Absolutely.
And my first question is really, you both have very successful careers in your individual disciplines. Why did you want to move into creating a theatrical work like this?
Erik, you start.
Well, I mean, I think it has something to do with Mitch winning this prize a couple of years ago, the Prix Pictet. So I think you should probably pick that story, because he won this prize and then he wanted to accept the prize in a more unusual.
And you could have just given a lecture or a talk or a thank you speech or something.
I was invited to do a presentation in Arles, in the south of France, at the photography festival there, and I knew that I would be going on stage in a Roman theater at 11:30 at night. By that time,
people don't want to hear a lecture.
Midsummer, they've mostly worked their way through at least a bottle of red wine.
Yeah.
And I also had already made this work and presented it in lecture format, and thought this would be a great challenge and opportunity to work collaboratively with Erik. We had met as we both became fathers. We met, I think, in '98, and have been friends since then, and we worked briefly together. And then I just had a gut feeling he would be fun to do this. And some of it for me as an artist is when you make something, you want to get it out of your studio. And there was a real pleasure in handing over this thing that I had invested myself in deeply and had finished formally, both put together in an exhibition context and also as a publication. And I wasn't really sure that I had anywhere else to go with it, per se. So by handing it to Erik, it enabled it to develop into something else. And in Arles, we took it to a certain distance. You're the instigator. You put us to the test.
That's right. And in that test, it's been probably a good solid year of works, or a year and a half since Arles. Or 2 years.
2 years now.
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, there's been extensive rehearsals. There's been the coming on of Annie B. Parson and Paul Lazar as kind of directorial advisors. There's been both have had some assistance around the creation of the work. What's been the most difficult part of the process for both of you individually?
Well, I think just coming to realizations about the script and refining the script, and I think performing. I think Mitch, is both of us are used to letting our work speak for itself a little bit, and I think it was a kind of a unique experience for Mitch to come out from behind the camera and have to.
Yeah, for me it was stepping into a discipline that I had absolutely no experience with. It was also, there was a certain amount that I let go of in handing the work to Erik and let him give it back to me, and that was really satisfying, because I felt like his pictures and his music inhabited what I did photographically, and it deepened and kind of enveloped the narrative that I wanted to suggest with the work that I made. But here it meant, I think, letting go a lot further and finding letting go of maybe the ways in which I had thought about the work and so on, and beginning to understand that as we would put this together as a piece to do on stage performatively, that there were other opportunities that they certainly hadn't come across my mind, and I don't think Erik's either. That was for me the gift, I think, of bringing in Annie B. Parsons and Paul Lazar, because they were respectful, but at the same time they came with a whole other set of tools and
experience
and vision.
And
it wasn't that they wanted to in some way completely take apart the work and to turn it into something else, but they wanted to, to exploit its opportunities as a stage piece.
And one of the things that you said too at the very beginning was that the heart of it is the music and the pictures, and they're so great, and so we didn't stray too far away from that chemistry that we discovered in early on.
Because there's always a danger of over-theatricalizing or moving into something that feels not authentic, in a theatrical context, which is, I know, something we all wanted to kind of avoid, to keep the heart of the piece as truly what those elements were. However, theater as a form, as filmmaking, is a intensely collaborative undertaking. And Mitch, I'm curious, you obviously have people who work with you, but creating photography, as a visual artist, it's a much more individual vision and effort. Did you find the nature of the collaborative activity that's required in making kind of an evening of theatrical work off-putting or enjoyable, or just a distinctly different process than what you do in making your work, or did you find a lot of similarities?
The process itself wasn't foreign to me because although my picture making is done in a way that's entirely solitary, I'm not discussing where do I put the camera, or I'm engaged, very one-to-one with the process. But leading up to it and in its aftermath, I very much open myself to collaboration in the studio. And the gift here working on this project was that Susan, my wife and longtime collaborator, was game to join in as script writer and just general participant in the critical discourse. And Ryan Spencer, who has been my studio manager for 7 years, also was game for the opportunity. And so I was not, it was, but what was, I think, in a personal way, really challenging for me was putting myself on stage. And finding a balance between a kind of reliance on script, and also getting to this place where I could be comfortable with a certain amount of extemporaneous performance. And that was, I think, one of the gifts for me, or the rewards of doing this project, is that I've worked through some of my own just inhibitions about putting myself in that place. It wasn't, I wasn't looking to do that. I mean, I think we all tend to,
Were there any moments where you thought, why did I do this? Or,
but I think it's that, and that in a way, it helped me to maybe just embrace more deeply my own narrative. Because in the end, it's a lot about the story is a lot about what I went through to get to the place of making this work, and where it took me. And I think that as I reminded myself through the course of shaping this, and I think a lot with Annie B. and Paul, they were helpful in finding ways that we could deepen that narrative that was respectful, but also in some ways engaging and mysterious as a stage piece.
Providing layers, instead of just having everything coming from Mitch all the time, we have layers in this piece, layers of voiceover and on stage and off stage, kind of Theater 101 kind of stuff.
And video monitor.
Live video. And music and picture, and music with voiceover, and music with Mitch speaking. And so, there's all these layers that kind of carve the time. So.
And speaking of time, that's the other real distinction between art forms, is that music and live performance, of course, you have to deal with time. It's a linear structure, and things flow, and the audience, you have them for a certain amount of time, and so you have to make decisions around that that focus of the audience and how much time, say, the images will stay up, the sequencing and the flow of the work. That's, I mean, with going into a gallery or spending time with a book, you can be an individual spectator, can be their own determining time keeper and can live with an image for an hour or 2 seconds. Did you find that interesting to have to take, Mitch, your work, your visual work, and actually determine for people kind of how much time they'll get with it and how that flows, almost choreographically and things?
Well, I think when I finally got to step into the potential for what we could do here, I began to think about it in the same way that I do every opportunity that I try to figure out how to form something. So if I'm doing a show of the work, I'll go look at the room and think about, well, how can I exploit the possibilities for this room with this particular body of work. Same with pages of a book. And so once I started to think about the context of the space of a theater and time, that we had a certain duration to kind of make work, and everything that we wanted to sort of, in a way, considered as elements, I opened up to that, and also was willing to let go of things, and at the same time to find new ways of making things active. I mean, there's a certain amount. I think one of the real, for me, also successes of this piece is that in this moment where everybody is making so many pictures so easily.
Everyone's cell phone.
And really giving kind of, very short attention to all those pictures. I think through the conversation that goes on with Erik to the pictures, and then embellished by the larger narrative, there's an encouragement to the viewer to slow up a little bit, and to inhabit these pictures and to look at them and read them in a way that will be rewarding and that will give you something back. And I think that was, going back to what Erik said earlier, that was the kind of that's the paradigm. It's this conversation about how to step into what it is that you're seeing, and some of that is aided, I think, through listening. I mean, Erik's, to me, it's exciting to watch him play with and to the pictures. He can,
because it changes the way the time passes.
Sure.
Because music is about time. It's so much about time. And one of the things we did was at Arl we had kind of a set number of seconds for each picture, but as we got into this idea of a theater piece and my playing with the pictures and improvising with the pictures, we started to vary the timing of how the pictures come in and out, and also I think it's somehow when you're watching the pictures without the music, the time feels different than with the music, and so that was an interesting discovery too.
Did you find that? I'm sure, Mitch, seeing your creations, your images, then supported by Erik's music, did you see the pictures in different ways then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And even we opened to doing things here or there that I had never thought about before. So I went back and I actually pulled some pictures, but there are certain flourishes that are a little bit cinematic or maybe more theatrical that suit this kind of presentation format. Exactly. But that's all new territory, but territory that's specific to this kind of venue.
And Mitch's pictures are so well suited to this because they're just like, they're operatic. They're not. They're big and filled with information, and I think they really are well suited to being projected on this giant screen.
In fact, I wondered about, one of my first initial worries is that the texture and the quality of seeing photographs in a gallery, can be quite different than projected large on screens. And I remember when we first talked, I think it was in Italy or something, where you had a really high-res projector, and it seemed like that you were comfortable enough with the resolution of the images. I think they look beautiful here, but
No,
Absolutely.
the projection is great.
In Aural, it was kind of special because the screens were like what?
oh, that was Aural
40
that
feet.
had
Yes, it was
this.
an Aural.
Oh,
It
okay,
was
okay.
huge.
It was
It
40 feet, and it was.
Yeah.
And it was an ancient Roman
Right.
amphitheater, and
Yeah.
and it was nighttime in summer. I mean, it had a lot of
Yeah.
chemistry going on there.
But we tend to be, as a museum as well as an art center, we tend to be,
Sensitive to
very sensitive and precious. And our visual art curators are, in the past, they've been very, they've asked, when things are not the real thing, but a projected version or a created version of a sculpture or something, that, of course, there's questions raised about, like, well, is this good enough? So I was very pleased that you're comfortable with your work being seen in this way.
Yeah, I think other than Aural, this is the best projection
Oh, good.
that I've had of my
Yeah,
work. I mean, I'm
yeah.
generally very, I agonize because I make these things, these pictures with
Yeah.
an 8x10 negative, and as
Right.
Erik inferred, they're layered, and they are very much about, they demand a kind of reading. The more you look into them, the more that comes back to you. And, when you're in a gallery, you can go in and study those details. I mean,
Right.
when you're in a theater, you are limited by the position of your seat and your physical relationship to that work. That's
and
where
and
these
the determination of time. That
and
if
time,
you want
yeah.
to stick with it,
yeah.
it
And
moves
that's
on.
where but then in this case, you have these other qualities
Right.
through the music, through what I bring to the stage,
Sure.
and how a certain narrative gets further. It's different,
And the
and I think
yeah.
that's interesting for me as an artist to have had this chance to step outside the context.
Yeah.
This is a black
Your normal
box.
context, yeah.
Usually I'm in a white box.
Yeah, right, exactly. And we talk about that endlessly here at the Walker, of course, because we have black boxes, dark spaces, white spaces, and and artists are wanting to transgress those boundaries. And it's interesting, such an ironic time we're living in. Curious if either of you want to comment on this, but even though we fret in the world of performing arts that this is becoming archaic, these are archaic kind of systems of getting real people in real time together collectively to experiencing something, not on their phone or not on another quicker vehicle. But at the same time, we find visual artists and filmmakers wanting to create live moments like this because of the concentrated focus. It requires people to slow down and to actually absorb in a different kind of way than they might quickly through Instagram or even going through a gallery quickly or something like that. Did you find that as part of the appeal or part of what's happening societally in terms of the world of culture?
I think in music, it's it's still live performance which generates almost everything. I mean, in terms of projects, that CDs, and I mean, the CD itself has become so unimportant, but
Right.
I mean, if it's just getting people there, it's just getting people I mean, I think people are lulled by how much entertainment is out there,
Right.
and it's almost, it's a buyer's market. I mean, they're just, there's all these sellers just offering things right and left with their hands out. But watch my entire season of my new show, and all at once. I mean, you don't even have to think. And so the buyers are just sitting back and just picking and cherry picking everything. So it's just getting people to live performance and getting to people to see people slowing down and observing another person with their craft, their honed craft.
Yeah.
That is still exciting for people. It's just that they have to get there to experience
That's right.
it.
And carving out, I think now, because time has become such a valuable commodity for people, actually someone carving out an evening and coming and sitting with their phones
huge.
off for an hour or two is, I think, while it's more difficult for people like me to get people to make those commitments, when they do, it seems to have a greater emotional and kind of
No, you
intellectual
still make
impact.
impact. I mean, it's still powerful. But
Well, it also so speaks to the nature of performance and to theater, and also in this time right now where all these performance artists are trying to find a way to to package and to preserve
To cut through
their
the
work.
noise.
But the fact
Yeah.
is that it's never the same twice.
No, right.
And it's that synergy. I think it's the allowance for the kind of things that are specific to those particular moments. It depends on who's in the audience. You know, we're doing this now. We'll do it again. It was different, and it was very, very different in R. We've developed it here. We won't, you know, we do it again 3 months later. We're not going to be exactly the same people bringing, or the same artists bringing, exactly the same kind of expression to it. And that's one thing that I guess I've really appreciated about Erik too, is also this flexibility to. I think we share one thing, which is that we're not crippled by our egos. We both had this kind of flexibility to work within this larger collaboration, but also to see that the thing itself it's got its own energy. It's its own organism,
right?
And it's had its own way of developing and finding itself.
Right. It finds its voice, and with that voice, it tells you what it needs. And I think sometimes if an artist goes in with a lot of preconceived notions, that's okay. You have to have a direction to strike out in. But the problems occur when you stop listening to what you're trying to create. It has a voice, and if you stop listening because you have all these preconceived notions, then you just end up with a far lesser product.
It seemed like that's why both of your process around the making of your work, in reading about it and knowing it to a certain extent, made the project feel so promising, because intuition you both talk about, improvisation, the notion of how you define composition in your work seemed to build in not necessarily a set structure at all times, but actually an openness. Mitch, you've talked about going and allowing the adventure and just things to sort of present themselves when you're seeking out one kind of photograph and suddenly something else interests you. And is that how, would you say that both of your definition of composition is about that kind of openness and then setting at some, obviously at some key point? And
I think so. I think we both work really hard at what we do, and I think that's a good observation.
I mean, for me, one other kind of personal reward, of this process was, the work in some ways, in its aftermath, was kind of a lament. There was a lot that was. There's a lot that I agonized about after I made this work. It wasn't easy to make it, to be out there in these situations where I was continually called into question as a photographer. Yeah. But also a lot of what I had to look at was troubling.
Right.
And in some ways it activated a kind of political sort of energy in me personally. I kept that very much at bay as I was making the work. I didn't set out with a political agenda, and I think I was even a little bit naive to how it was becoming more political just because of the nature of the themes at hand. But what I appreciated about working with Erik was he, on a number of occasions, reminded me that I am an artist, and that I'm not at service to beating the drum, even though I personally feel some of those things. And in the end, that position is one taking a kind of more detached position in terms of the presentation allows for really something that was more truthful to the work itself. That I didn't have to be so heavy-handed about it. Not that the work I don't think is heavy-handed at all, but it was about how but it was like I was thinking, after I made it, well, this has also a certain usefulness. But in the end, I think it is just it's the enigmas that are held in the work. It's not about the work asks questions. Yeah. It's not prescriptive. And that was good to have
yeah.
those kind of cues at times
Yeah.
from Erik. And I think we've kind of we've really kind of edited that down.
I noticed,
and I
with
think it's more
various
friendly in a way.
editions of the script, some of that was removed. Even since you've been here last week, just honing down that script a little bit more and allowing the images and the music to speak for themselves, and trusting the audience will
Exactly.
Right.
gain that.
Right.
Because that's what spoke to me.
Right. Did you find yourself politicized, like as just part of that 6-year process, or 8 years, or more than you were? Say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because I felt in some ways choked
Right.
by a lot of what I've just confronted, a kind of complacency and just a power structure that was, at times indomitable.
And it seemed
the,
like
on the corporate and government end.
And the politics seem to be both with a capital P and a small. In some ways, one of the themes that comes out in the work is the freedom to be able to observe the world without restriction, and that the artist's right, or anyone's right, to observe and to capture images, and that post 9/11 it seemed that people were putting up barriers all over in front of you and others who tried to capture images. Obviously there was a kind of hysteria, but also probably something of a valid concern around
Absolutely.
energy sites, and are they safe and secure, and that seemed one point. And the other was just strictly environmentalism, and a sort of lack of consciousness, it seemed, around how we're generating power and what its impact is doing on the landscape. Did you find yourself having those, the piece having the parallel themes, and then how to kind of hone it down, or would you say that really, when you're talking about the politics, it was really around environmental action and the question of...
Well, it's the dialogue too that seems so played out now. It just seems like the dialogue is not healthy, in terms of what to do about these issues that you seem to be confronting. But I was always encouraging Mitch and Susan, and just the thrust of the picture, to get back to what that initial feeling was about what was driving Mitch to make those pictures, and it was just this curiosity, and this openness, and I think I don't know about the development of the political.
Well, I think it was, for me, as it deepened as a project, it was a challenge but a necessary one, to look into the complexity of these themes. And again, it wasn't that I ever expected the work to offer any answers, but I felt that the work was resolved in some way, in that it has a kind of transparency. And it humbled me, and I think that humbling was something that I hoped could be conveyed to my audience. And I really think that the work also is very specific to an American context. I really thought I wasn't thinking, how to deal. But by thinking specifically about the American landscape and our cultural history and environmental history, it was, there were boundaries that I could kind of deal with. So I wasn't dealing with these themes in just general ways. It was a lot of a kind of cultural experience for me, and that's where I gave myself even some license as I was making the work, to touch on things that were cultural, that related sometimes even in kind of quirky, idiosyncratic ways to the theme American power. There's a picture, we're not actually using it here, but of an electric chair. Which it was a lot of things I just stumbled upon. Here and there, that were kind of tangents, but also kind of meaningful, punctuating ones, to let the work just breathe and and have some kind of expansion and not be so, strictly serving a certain strict kind of theme.
Because it is such an enormous theme. I mean, and
well, it's absurd.
Yeah, you allude to it at the start or during the piece. It's like, wow, this could be, a life's work. I mean, but was that daunting at times? It's like, there's so many aspects and so many layers and things. How do you choose your path exactly?
Well, it must have been exciting at a certain point to just start to discover what other areas you could find your way into.
I mean, I even made the allowance for sexual power
Right.
in the end, where there's a couple that are in these fast-running river waters leading up to Niagara Falls. So I'm up at Niagara Falls. I'm trying to figure out how to make a picture that's not the
that
cliche
was one
of
of the more abstract, like you needed to find the connections as a viewer.
But the picture, in a way, I think, is about just the ways in which we are, we will step up to sort of the precipice of the mountain, and
Right.
And have this kind of fearlessness about nature. So it is more abstract, but I think that it was allowing for those kind of more rule-breaking pictures, which which humanize it in
Sure,
some way, and make you
right.
think a little bit differently about what's more sort of center stage thematically. I mean, going back to what you originally said, there's no question that having lived through the experience of making the work, and even this process of putting myself at risk, and also really going back to square one. Because
Right.
I made the work, but when we decided to do this thing here, all the crutches, all the whole tool set that I had, a black box is not the same as a white box.
Right.
Working collaboratively in the ways that I had didn't really prepare me for the intelligence and intensity of Annie B. Parsons and Paul. I have to say, they were really great. And
Amazing,
they just cut through it all, as Erik
Right.
said.
I'm so
but
glad
in the
that
end,
choice worked out.
Yeah, me too.
in the end, one comes away, I think, from these kinds of experiences with a deepened artistic power. And I think that was maybe the greatest other, sort of reward for me of this whole experience with American Power, which is that, when you're in sort of the presence of these things that are so large and so overwhelming, you're just a single individual, you're an artist, you feel just daunted.
Yeah, right.
But in the end, authorship is something that is truly profound and that is grounding in a way, and the risks do take you to some place that's different than you've been before, and it's frightening, but it's exciting.
Right. You both talk about a little bit, also the vulnerability of the role of the artist in some ways. You, as a solo artist, Erik, when you're on stage, you're playing, it's all up to you in some ways musically.
Right.
When you're playing a piece on solo cello, and I think as an individual artist making images, there is a vulnerability, and I wondered if you felt like that's, in a broader sense, the role of the artist in society, is to be vulnerable in that way.
I found that, a couple of things. One is the process of that, like Mitch went through, or that I went through with Block Ice and Propane, of really putting yourself out there. You learn about what it is that you're made of, and what it is that matters to you, and what it is that your art is about. And one of the things that I've discovered in performance is that if I have everything too locked up and figured out, that I'm not vulnerable to the material. I'm not vulnerable to the audience. The audience wants to see you being open to them, and open
the humanity.
to the humanity. You're not, and if everything is too figured out, you're kind of walling yourself off.
Right.
And one of my things over the last couple of years is, or last 5 or 10 years, is kind of pushing away my desire to hide behind complexity, because it's very easy to be complex and think you've got something figured out.
Right.
And So
Has that changed the nature of your work?
yeah, I think I used to feel like I wanted to be like virtuoso.
Right.
And now I feel like I just want to be expressive. And I think that's a really, I wish I'd learned that lesson.
That's kind of a profound,
yeah,
realization.
it is. It's big. I recently did a retrospective of my music at the Stone in New York City, and I listened to some of these old records, and I was like, wow, that guy can really play, but wow, that's some complicated music.
It's funny because it sort of seems like the opposite of what one might expect is like as you get older and you gain more skill or whatever, your work gets more dense and complicated. Actually, you're stripping away in a certain way.
Right, right.
When you talked about the collaboration and things and getting rid of crutches, while this isn't a crutch, Erik is not just any composer, performer, but besides his incredible sensitivity, you have a history with your father's work as a great photographer and your work with photography through Block Ice and just your knowledge of photography. Do you think because of your own DNA and also your own appreciation for photography as an art form, that you brought something completely different than a different composer performer might have?
I think possibly yes. I think the one thing that I have is that, and I think an artist needs this when you confront something like this, is that not to be too respectful.
Right.
You can't be cowed by great work. I mean, if it has to be, there has to be something there. There has to be some creative juices that get going. And if you're too bowing down to everything, then that's what's going to come across in the music. It's just this kind of, and I think when I grew up with my father taking pictures, and it was like he just got up to go to work, and it was nothing special or about it at all. Like in retrospect. And
that came through the family road trips,
Yeah, the family road trips, and I just feel like, I had a feeling that I'm comfortable with the art form, and I'm not cowed by it.
And you could be playful and humorous and other things.
Exactly.
With it, and,
exactly.
Was that refreshing when you started working together, that Erik had that approach?
Yeah, there was. I trusted him, and I loved Block Ice and Propane, and I felt like I learned a lot about Erik and his formation from that piece. That things that I just had no idea of. How did he become a musician, and how even his early family life in some way shaped that.
I didn't know it either before I started that.
But it's always been I don't know that we've ever. I mean, we've not always agreed on 100% on things, but there's just been a kind of real ease of communication. The way that we've worked together, a kind of given respect, but also a generosity that I think is at the core of our friendship. So we're meeting in some place, and I think probably, I mean, I can say myself, I don't think I could have done it necessarily with somebody else. Certainly as satisfyingly, because. That's not a given. There's a kind of it's been fun. It's not just it's been work in a serious way, but it's been pleasurable. And for me, it's thinking about the nature of collaboration. When Erik, we went to R, we came back. I felt honored by what he did, and Erik was about to go in the studio and to record. And I said, well, let's make an LP so that we can do something that's more classical with photography incorporated, as a graphic element, and make a poster and so on. And it was a wonderful experience.
And actually, my receipt of that LP, when you guys were nice enough to send it, that kind of, it was. I just sort of felt like it presented beautifully the possibilities of what the work could become.
Right.
But in fact, where the music has gone from there, it's quite some distance. And we even actually, I think, there was one moment where you had veered kind of quite far away from it as
I
a
had
recording.
taken out almost all of it.
And then, I kept listening to the album, and I said, well, let's maybe, so
Yeah.
we both listened to each other, and it sort of went back a little bit toward, toward some of what it was originally, because it was really great.
Right. Yeah.
So, but it was going back to what I said earlier, where to me it was like about handing this thing to Erik. Then he made that music and he handed it back to me, and then you stepped in,
Right.
and then I felt like, okay, that's where I got Susan and Ryan involved, and we started to sort of see, well, how can we then take this and deepen it in its storytelling, in its narrative, and come up with some new ways to formalize it that can work in this context. And then we gave that back to Erik.
And then we gave it to Annabelle in the fall, and they handed it back to us. And so we passed it around.
And as you know, in the beginning, before we started to work with them, when we had said it was January, because Erik and I, we met. We both lived downtown, and we both lived through the blackout post Sandy.
Sure.
And we had this kind of remarkable walk through the Lower East Side, through the flooded areas. Erik came over for lunch. We didn't have lights, but we had gas. Susan made a wonderful lunch, and then
What a context to talk about this project.
Yeah.
So we went out, and then a month or so, or just a month later or so, I heard the story of my bookkeeper who lived in Long Beach, and I thought, oh, this is a great way to. We were looking for an epilogue. We were looking for some way to go forward. And, then I just jumped into making a short film. And it was a very satisfying experience. And I think, again, put me into, a position where I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And, but it was, in a way, it was really fascinating because it was, I was not really inhabiting the whole piece. It was just like, this could be really good because it brings it into the present, and in some way it takes it to some other place. But in fact, it wasn't as interesting as it needed to be, or as relevant, because it wasn't my story. It was someone else's story.
Yeah, once we got into developing the piece, it was like the ending became more clear, and that it wasn't the ending.
Right. And in fact, the structure, in some ways, when you were talking about Black Ice, really being so informative about Erik's life and upbringing, in some ways, American Power expanded into framing your work prior to American Power and your work coming out of it. I wondered if you'd want to talk about how you came up with the ending around talking about your next cycle of work focused on the trees of New York. I mean, there seems to be a direct link from seeing all this industrial creation of power, and you said in the work, you don't quite explain why, you leave it for people to figure out, that you felt lost and depleted by the end of American Power. And then we get to experience just a taste of your cycle of tree imagery, which is so beautiful in black and white at the end of the work. How did you come up with that ending? And
well, let me just put one little short thing. Is we were looking for some way to end on a note of, like, we wanted to ask questions with this piece. We wanted to leave people. We didn't want to beat a drum loudly in one particular direction, but we wanted to maybe have the audience asking questions. But we also, we showed the piece a few times, and people were craving in these showings some answer and
hope.
Some and some hope. And so I think that maybe you can take it from there. But
yeah, in the end, I wrestled with how to absorb the experience of having made that work, and then how to not fall prey to just responding to having made that work in a way that was didactic. Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, incorporating my own artistic process and choice, and then bringing in the work that I made as a kind of, not necessarily a literal response, but as a step forward, I think was meaningful, because in some ways it it's a kind of, it incorporates my own personal story as an
Right.
artist.
Right.
You know, and that it really then it is kind of serving as an epilogue. I mean, you know, in terms of how the larger piece is framed, I show first pictures that I made in my early 20s.
Right.
Where I traveled around the country and was largely photographing people at leisure, engaged with various kinds of recreational activity. But that experience, in some way, was the experience that introduced me to the American landscape and gave me a certain kind of appreciation and connection to it. So that work in the 70s was very key to some of how I felt driving, you know, around and doing these regional trips for American Power in the last decade, in this millennium. And so in some way, what comes before does have some kind of impact on what goes after. What I liked about was, you know, and also it, without being prescriptive, stepping to the trees, it makes clear that everybody has their own set of possibilities to turn to. And there's no one answer. It's
Right.
not like, you know, I'm telling everybody they have to, you know, support your environmental causes or, you
Right.
know,
No.
beat the drum. But it's about a kind of an appreciation for what we have here,
Right.
all around us, but in a way that is still, I think, aesthetically and formally very, very rigorous. Those
Right.
pictures are not, you know, I worked as hard to make those, and
Yeah,
I think
they're
that
not romantic.
they're not
Yeah,
romantic,
no.
and they are about this kind of kinship between humanity and nature,
Yeah,
and in a way
absolutely.
that we don't necessarily always see with that kind of clarity.
Yeah, and not to be too literal about it, but it seems like after visiting, you know, landscapes and rural areas and small towns, and you saw the impact of huge power on those places, man-made power generation, and then to be in such an urban setting like New York City and see the survival and beauty of nature that is still there in the city, seemed to kind of flip the tables a little bit.
Well, I don't think I never thought about nature in a precise way while I was making American Power, but afterward, and when I looked closely at the work, I saw that the trees were, that I exploited them, that they were this kind of running leitmotif in the work, and that they were the foil for industry.
That's interesting.
And that, in a way, I took, you know, this, I really very kind of, I think, consciously took them at that point when I started to do the New York Arbor series and brought them center stage. But in some way there is this kind of inversion. It's not, you know, I think it's, you know, was helpful that I photographed in black and white, because that helped me skirt around some of the challenges of the picturesque in photography. And yet still incorporate the trappings of contemporary urban life. So I wanted these pictures to feel and to look like they're made in the present. But I didn't want the contemporary landscape to overwhelm the nature, which it could have had I shot it in color. And so it was, but you know, this is like
hindsight.
It's hindsight, but also it's about listening. You know, it's Erik going to preparing for the stone and listening to how he felt at a certain point he needed to present himself as a virtuoso musician because it was the place to head toward. But then once he mastered that virtuosity, take it from an observer. He could then, you know, incorporate it and then feel a kind of freedom about it. And I think that's what happens when you're really in your work and kind of in a way seamlessly, you know, moving along and growing with it. You have those possibilities. I mean, that's what, you know, in a way it's it's the blessing, and it's also at times the damnation.
Yeah.
How to stay really in the currency.
Right,
Eric has this
right.
word he uses, and I love it, and I'm kind of going to be stealing it from him now and then, which is just the flow,
Right.
not interrupting.
Yeah.
What comes along intuitively, and I was already working on another project when I started the trees.
Right.
And I just had this epiphany that that other project was far too ambitious. It was like a kind of a repeat of taking on something
Right.
impossible like American Power. I wanted to be home, spend more time with my family.
Yeah.
And I live in this wonderful city that was worth looking at in
Yeah.
a way that I hadn't looked at before.
There's one moment in the piece that I just have to ask about, which I think in some ways is kind of the emotional apex of the work, both musically and visually. There's this image of a painted wall with an old turn-of-the-century, steam engine, in which you then pull back, and the image is just like it's movement, and you're coming back, and the image just becomes more and more powerful as it's this tapestry of some kind of like honorary tribute to American industry on the landscape, but then surrounded by the true landscape and its kind of ugliness and things. But then I think, Erik, you're repeating a theme from earlier in the work at that point. And did you guys build it in that way, that this would be kind of a beautiful kind of
Not really.
center moment?
It became that, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
anything about that image, where you got it, or what, how?
Well, I had gone to as the project was really coming at full kind of speed toward, in the last year in 2008. And there was all this stuff going on because of the elections.
Right.
I went to Denver and to St. Paul to be, in the context of those conventions. And also I thought, is there a way in which I could in some sense touch on the industry,
Right.
the energy industry lobby, and these things that were also relating to the power structure that was making decisions about our energy situation.
Right, yeah.
So I went from Denver up to Wyoming after seeing that the Democratic Convention was sponsored by the Clean Coal Coalition. And, what was, in a visual way just kind of startling was that they had these big, 16-wheeler flatbed, trucks with these giant ads advertising clean coal, moving through Denver.
Right.
And
Is that what that was, that image? Or
no, that image is not that.
No.
But then I went up to the, I think it's called the Powder River Basin. It's the northeastern Wyoming kind of quadrant, which is actually where most of our oil, our coal is being dug in the surface mines now.
Right,
It's not.
right.
We always think of Kentucky and West Virginia,
yeah.
but those mines are more or less
Played out.
not at their capacity anymore. They're played out, and so and I had I wasn't able to get into any of the coal mines in the Appalachian side. So
Right.
here I thought, let me just try at least to drive around there, and I wrote letters, and in fact I actually did get into one, but just driving around Gillette. One cold morning after being there in Denver, I saw this giant billboard, and there was a certain kind of paint by number Andy Warhol quality
right.
to it. It's not easy making pictures of other pictures, be
Right,
they.
sure.
It's a whole kind of motif that's. But there was something at that moment. It was the light. It was early morning. It was very blue. It was kind of cool. And then there were these kind of, I think they must have had, I think it was a place for trucks to fill up
they
with
were
gas
like
and
gas
stuff. It was very
handles
minimal
coming
in a
out.
certain
Yeah,
way.
Right. Did you? When did you decide to do for this work the pulling back of the image?
We were trying to find ways to do transitions and to sort of break the kind of the tempo of just
right.
image to image.
Right.
And at first, Ken Burns and the whole kind of documentary aesthetic of going back to old images and moving around them. It's in a way it's a bit it's challenging because it's so established in a way that
it could have become a
it can be a little cliched.
Right.
And but what I was continually trying to do, and we tried it a number of times and it didn't quite work, was to to call attention to the layering of the pictures.
Sure.
Erik said there's a lot. There's a lot in them to look at, and how to sort of, in a way, call attention to a detail. And I don't remember how it happened. We were in the studio, and it was just like, maybe it's about starting on a detail and just slowly kind of panning out in a kind of cinematic way as a reveal, and that it could work once. And it was a good picture to do it with. I think it was not expected.
That's true.
It's so flat in a certain way, and then it becomes dimensional.
Yes,
and so, and it speaks to, like you said, it speaks to the ambition. It speaks to my wanting to understand something of the American psyche. And how we, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It does come out of that frontier. It does come out of the way we did have to kind of pioneer our way through these territories, and we claimed them. We got accustomed to a certain sense of ownership and property and expectation, and that it's not so to sort of change that mindset, or you have to understand where was that, and I think that picture speaks to that whole frame of mind. I don't know how you think about it, but it's interesting.
Erik, I was just going to ask you one quick question about soundtracks. You've done 3 in this year, and sometimes when we think about Hollywood soundtracks, we think, well, the music is there to command a certain emotional response, or to manipulate in a certain way, or to be
heighten,
really subservient, or to be functional almost. Obviously, your work here is not soundtrack in any way, in that way. I don't know your soundtrack work as well, but
it's a completely different
it's
job.
Completely different than doing soundtrack work is different than your own music.
Well, I have the ability to take ownership of this music in a way that, whereas when I'm doing when I'm doing the soundtrack, you always wish for that feeling, but you're really more serving the director's goodwill.
Even with films you admire and filmmakers who are
absolutely.
filmmakers.
Because a lot of times, you'll get what you want, and if you have a good rapport and a good communication with the director. But in this case, it's somewhat similar at times to support the images and to allow time to flow in a way that feels that doesn't feel too slow, but then sometimes I'll emerge and push forward in front of the pictures, and I feel like I'll push through that barrier, and then I'll go back to being supportive, and so it's
and at times the images go away entirely, and you're just playing too. And, I thought that was interesting that you said there's really a mix of approaches. Sometimes you're serving the images, sometimes they're I don't know, not so often do they clash, but sometimes they're not necessarily subservient to one another, and other times you're in the lead kind of.
Well, it's important to create some tension, and sometimes the tension is like the music going against the pictures, or stepping in front, and then stepping back, and then or the audience is so used to seeing something up on the screen, all of a sudden, no, you have to listen to the cello. There's nothing up there. Where are you looking now? I think human beings are just naturally attracted to the flickering light, and there's a tension when we take it away from them. It's like, we want it back.
That's really true. Well, do you have hopes for the project now with the world premiere tonight? Is it something you'd like to see touring around in the years ahead?
We'd like to do it, for sure. We'd like to take it to Europe. I think that'd be interesting for them to see it.
Well, I wondered about that. I just wrote a friend in Canada who runs a big festival, and I was halfway through pitching the project. You guys, you have to look at this, sending the trailers, and realizing then that it's Canada. But at the same token, I thought, given the energy issues they're facing, this could be a very interesting project, even outside of the U.S. necessarily.
I think so. I think it would travel well. What do you think?
Any other last thoughts about?
No, just I would second what Erik said, because I think the success of the piece is that that tension is constantly shifting.
Right.
You might think that you've sort of come to understand the language of where it's going, and then it's somewhere else.
Right.
And there are times that, yes, the attention is really more toward the cello. The pictures are turning your attention, back to the music, and vice versa.
And there's that time you step
so-
behind a video camera and film and live film Erik playing toward the end of the piece.
Yeah, well, that was it. Really, in a way, it's, to me, that's kind of this distillation.
Yeah.
And also, it's this reduction of what's really most essential here, which is the opportunity of looking and the meaning of looking, and that, from my perspective, on stage, looking toward Erik is not the same as the perspective of everybody else
Right.
In the audience, and that that in some kind of very, I think, simple but resonant way, it works. It could, again, it was a bit. I think it was a bit risky, but
Right.
that Annie B and Paul, they had this idea that I should even be. I think they were thinking initially, like, you could take an 8x10 camera in this
Right.
dark
Set it
space,
up
and
yeah.
I could photograph the audience or do this and that. I mean, in a way, at first it was a little ironic, because I have this camera that's this consumer little tiny high def camera that's I could fit it in the palm of my
Right.
hand. And it's very low tech compared to the
Like
somewhat
the camera
archaic
in the
A-type.
pre-show that you're using with a big
Yeah,
hood.
that's
and,
the 8x10.
Yeah,
8x10,
and yet that every tool can generate a strong picture.
It's about the eye of the
It's
person
what you do.
behind
It's
it,
what you
yeah.
do with it, and it's
Right.
also interesting to just see. Yeah, I mean, I'm using it as a kind of way to illuminate what's going on in the studio, on the table, as it's part of the theatrical piece, and then taking it away from there, and then, in a sense, almost kind of stepping away and making it something that's versatile.
Yeah.
As you see the piece in the beginning when the audience comes in, and they're up on a ladder.
Yeah.
It's almost, I like that little scene, because it's it shows that there's a kind of labor.
Right.
And that's something I try to call attention to. That
Yeah.
it's not like you have to figure it out. There's a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
It's almost a little funny to look at,
Right.
because of what's what's going on. So.
Well, I want to thank you both for this time, and also for making such a powerful, beautiful work. And we'll look forward to it having a long future ahead.
Thanks, Philip.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks.
for welcoming us and supporting us. This, I'm sure, could not have happened in this way anywhere else, and we
Yeah,
both
that's really
appreciate it.
tremendous.
Well, thank you.